Good evening. I want to introduce you to a current affairs program on politics, and having been given an outline, I'm relieved that it's a hypothetical. Hypotheticals have been used at Harvard Law School for the past 50 years. Students were briefed to adopt particular roles in hypothetical situations to familiarise themselves with the practice of the law. But hypotheticals can also be an effective way of illuminating current affairs on television. Tonight's was recorded in Canberra and is concerned with decision-making in government and the public service. Taking part are two ministers of the government, leading public servants, ministerial advisors, backbenchers, and representatives of business, the unions, and the media. It's an imaginary situation devised by the moderator, Geoffrey Robertson, about a bicentennial project, a hypothetical bicentennial project, and I stress I had nothing to do with it. That means we can all enjoy it.
A new federal government has just been elected, ladies and gentlemen, on a platform promising enterprise, reconstruction, and great national works. Works like the Austrain project, the fastest train in the world, speeding between Sydney and Canberra in 59 minutes. Australia has the technology to build the engines, the labour to lay the fast tracks, the passengers to make it a paying proposition. At least, that's what the election manifesto said. It said that Austrain would create 40,000 new jobs, foster enterprise, encourage national technology, service at least 6 marginal electorates, and be a great boost for the country in the bicentennial year. Be good for tourism too, John Brown. You've done rather well in your last portfolio, and you can expect promotion. What cabinet job do you think you deserve?
Well, I've made a deal with the Prime Minister. I don't want his job. He's not going to get mine. I'd like to stay with tourism if I could, and particularly as you've now given me an indication of this super-fast train, and I've always had a great fascination with trains, and as Australia is a vast country, and we need to get Australians seeing their country. To me, that seems like a marvellous innovation. I'd love to still have that portfolio if I can have control of the train.
Aha! Well, you're sitting at home in your electorate in Sydney a couple of days after the election. You get a telephone call from the Prime Minister. She tells you that she's appointing you Minister for Enterprise. The Department of Enterprise is crucial to this government's ideas for intervention to boost industry and create new jobs. She's looking forward to your cabinet submission on the Austrain project. Get on the train, son, are her final words. How do you start?
Well, there's an old expression in politics, I guess, when the gravy train leaves the station, make sure you've got a seat. So I'll get on the train. How would I start? Well, first of all, I'd need a very expert advisor.
Well, first of all, you've got to get to Canberra. It's Sunday night. First plane is what time Monday morning?
Oh, 7 o'clock.
7 o'clock. You get there, your secretary hasn't had a chance to book, so you'll have to join the standby queue with Mr. Ramsey, who's the political correspondent of the Australian Herald, and Dick Smith, the chairman of Smith Industries, whose helicopters have all been grounded by the Department of Aviation. I'm afraid, gentlemen, that we have only one seat left for this plane. Who's going to get it? Can you prevail upon Mr. Ramsey to give up his place?
Mr. Ramsey, would you please give up your seat so that the Minister can get to Canberra and see about this marvellous train that I'm about to take over in my new Department of Enterprise?
Why should I?
Well, in the interests of promoting jobs for young Australians, I thought that you, being a journalist of some great decency, might just do that.
I need to get to Canberra just as importantly as you do, because I want to cover the story in Canberra. I want to know what's going on, and why should a politician have preference over the press?
I've just
or anybody else in the community. Why should a politician seek to bump somebody else off a plane just because he thinks that, or he or she thinks that their necessity to get there is more important than anybody else's?
Because 75,000 wise electors have just elected me 2 days ago to go to Canberra and help run this nation.
Then do what you usually do, catch a VIP plane.
No, I don't, actually.
You have an appointment with the Prime Minister at 10 o'clock. Does that help you convince him?
Well, I hope it does.
Mr. Ramsey?
She is a very strong lady, apparently, whoever she is.
No, no. Doesn't convince me at all.
Your appointment hasn't been announced yet. It will be announced tomorrow. Maybe you could swap him some information. Offer him an exclusive.
I'd accept that.
Well, you've got rid of Mr. Ramsey. Mr. Smith, will you give up your seat in the national interest?
Yes, I certainly would. I'd offer him the seat instantly, because it would be a good way of keeping on side with the minister, an honest way of keeping on side with him, and it wouldn't matter if I went on the next aircraft.
You know the parable of Androcles and the lion. You do him a little favour and he might be in a position to reward you handsomely.
Possibly.
Smith Industries is hoping to build the super train. Does that excite you?
Yes, it does. Even though I know that the track record for railways has not been very good, I believe that there's going to be some very good profits in it.
Well, you've done a study. You're going to license the technology from the French, who have a very fast train running between Paris and Lyon. And you've hired Ben Lexcon and Ralph Sarich to improve it a little, and it will be the fastest train in the world by the time you've finished with it. You've got your submission in on the minister's desk, a joint submission with the New South Wales government to build the super train. Have a word with your assistant, your political assistant, David Hill, about this project.
David, there's this proposition about a very fast super train. I favour it greatly. Given my abiding interest in tourism and the need to improve the transport systems in Australia, I'd like to push ahead very strongly with this proposition.
And I'd say it was visionary stuff. I'd say it was the new Sydney Opera House, and I'd be in it.
You'd be in it. What other advantages does it have?
Well, you would take a lot of road coaches off the roads. You would provide a much better service by rail between Sydney and Canberra than you do now. You'd cut the journey times from about 4 hours to just around an hour, I think you said.
That's right, 59 minutes.
And you'd take a lot of cars off the road. Good visionary stuff. As long as the government goes in with its eyes wide open about the size of the subsidy you'd need to operate it, then I think you should go for it in a big way.
Go for it in a big way. Mr. Lanigan, what is your view of the super train?
Wildly impracticable. It'll never get off the ground. It won't work anyway.
It's not supposed to. It's a train, not a plane.
The costs are obviously going to far exceed the benefits. Canberra's a small town. It can't support a train like this. This is utterly different to running between Tokyo and Osaka and places like this. You just can't do this sort of thing in Australia. The costs of this are far in excess of the benefits. What would have to be given up to pay for this train is just beyond contemplation.
Mr. Brown, Mr. Lanigan is head of the Department of Enterprise. Mr. Lanigan, you're minister.
Yes, last time I had a new minister, I forgot to welcome him. He resented that. He told me afterwards, let's make sure that we don't do it on this occasion anyway.
How are you going to dampen your minister's enthusiasm for the super train?
Well, we've got to tell him about when Sir Arthur Fadden was the treasurer, and people would ask him about why don't you do this and why don't you do that, and he'd always produce in Parliament an enormous compendium of all the proposals, and he'd say, every one of these is a wonderful idea, but if you put them all together, they'll cost something like $100 million or £100 million. There was a lot in those days.
Well, the name of this department is Enterprise, and I'm not prepared to be the head of a department called Enterprise that isn't prepared to take a gamble on Australia's future. Now, referring me to Artie Fadden is like looking back down a time tunnel.
Mr. Lanigan, you're dining this evening with your old friend, Sir Lennox Hewitt, who is head of the Prime Minister and Cabinet Department. He asks you how you're getting on with your new minister.
Well, then I'm really worried. He seems to have a completely unsophisticated idea of what's practical in this situation. How are we going to convince him? We've got to go along with him. We've got to let him have his little idiosyncrasies, let him have his dream, but somehow we've got to get him to face up to this. We've got to move quietly, though. It's no good stepping in and asking him to drop it. He's committed to it. Somehow we've got to take the soft line. Have you got any ideas on how we can convince him?
I don't think I'd see it quite that way, Pat. I've never felt that it's the responsibility of a permanent head or a department to frustrate a government or frustrate a minister. And I think the thing we have to remember is that John Brown and his colleagues were elected on a policy, and that policy included the construction of this rail line. That's our starting point.
That's fine, but who are they going to blame if it doesn't work? Are they going to blame themselves, or are they going to blame the officials who haven't told them about all the details?
There's always been an element of dirt money in our remuneration, and we're all familiar with being turned upon in times of stress on ministers.
I suppose we've got to accept that, but I'm worried about the whole thing. Somehow we've got to get them to face up to all the implications and not just the bright outer veneer of this project.
Any way of delaying it, setting up an interdepartmental committee? Or
well, that's the obvious
Royal
answer.
Commission?
Well, a Royal Commission would be ideal, but it's not sufficiently exciting at the moment to get that. Why don't we have an interdepartmental committee? We can at least put him in the position where if he goes ahead, someday that report might surface, and he's taking the responsibility of going ahead in spite of all the facts. I think, Glenn, we could at least do that, couldn't we? We could at least make sure that he's fully briefed on the downside of this whole thing. So I think there's a problem.
You are a middle-ranking public servant in the Department of Enterprise. You've just qualified for your Free American Express card, and you're using it this evening to dine at the same restaurant that Sir Lenox and Mr. Lanigan are dining at, and you overhear snatches of Mr. Lanigan's conversation. Expensive folly, must put a spoke in the wheel, have to derail Austrain. Do you mention this to your minister when you see him next day on another matter?
If I'm seeing him on another matter, I will have no reason to raise this. I would want to speak first with my secretary to argue with him about whether or not we will be supporting the minister on this particular proposal.
Whether or not you'll be supporting the minister on this particular proposal, but isn't it your duty as a public servant to support your minister, my minister, right or wrong?
By support, I mean whether we're going to be wholeheartedly behind with him taking the direction, or whether we're going to work out ways in which we can turn what we might consider to be a very expensive proposal into something that will be of benefit to the country.
What we must do is make sure that in their political euphoria they don't get embarked on something that is crazy, because when it becomes seen to be crazy, they will not take the blame, they will blame their advisors for not holding them back. And that is one of the most obvious political realities we've got to face up to.
Is a public servant's duty to the government of the day or to a broader idea of the public interest?
It's to the Crown, not to the minister. It is to the Crown, to the sovereign, of whom for the time being, be it a day or two perhaps, or be it 20 years, is represented by this government.
So you're in favour of the idea of the Westminster system, the anonymous, apolitical public servant?
I think it's the best that we had, but having passed into restful peace, it's no use repining it.
You think we've gone from the Westminster system? That's gone out the window?
Undoubtedly.
Should we then move to the Washington system, where ministers appoint, the incoming government appoints people committed to its own programs and policies, to all the senior jobs in the public service?
Oh, I think the sooner the better. This halfway house we've been residing in over the last 10 years or so is a very unsatisfactory...
What do you mean by halfway house?
A situation in which permanent heads and departments are nominally advising ministers, and yet because of mutual distrust and suspicion, they have their own separate advisors appointed in their private offices, and the one thinks it's competing with the other in advising the government or the minister.
Mr. Dawkins, your proposals are taking us down the line to Washington with more opportunities for ministers to bring in their own consultants and advisors. Is this something that you're in favour of? Goodbye, Sir Humphrey. Hello, Mr. Haldeman, Mr. Ehrlichman.
It's not only in Australia where you can repine the demise of the Westminster system. I mean, it doesn't operate even in Britain anymore. And I just think it's inevitable that there has to be a more contemporary, there has to be a more relevant public service which does not just give dispassionate advice. It has to take into account what the government wants to do, and indeed the sooner in the decision-making process it does, the better.
Mr. Smith, you're going to have some opposition. It's clear with Austrain you're going to have opposition from within the public service, opposition from MPs whose electorates won't benefit, opposition probably from the opposition. Would you hire a lobbyist to help you find your way around Canberra?
Yes, I think I would. I think that one of the first things I would do is obviously decide on my board that obviously the amount of money which was going to be spent on the railway was going to be a tremendous amount of money, so it was well worth trying to facilitate getting it going as soon as possible.
Hire Mr. Sekuless.
Mr. Sekuless, what I'd like you to do is to find out, first of all, whether the senior bureaucrats are on side with this railway. I've heard that they're not. If you can try and find that out through the normal means in Canberra, on the grapevine and so forth. And then possibly I'd like to be able to talk to the secretary and or take down a submission to him to see if we can convince the bureaucrats, because I believe the minister's on side, but I have a feeling that possibly the bureaucrats aren't.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Smith. This is a wonderful proposal, and in the national interest, I propose not to charge you any fee for this, because...
You'll take a commission on the profits.
I will take... we'll discuss that later, perhaps, because unlike my journalistic colleagues here, we lobbyists can see what is in the national interest, and we'll proceed on this matter accordingly.
Wonderful, wonderful.
What can you do for him that he can't do for himself?
Absolutely nothing, actually. But I've got the time. Yeah.
He doesn't
don't let him into the secret. Very little. There's very little. There's very little.
But you're a registered lobbyist. You're on the register.
I hope so.
What does that mean, to be a registered lobbyist?
What it means is that we comply with a funny sort of scheme that the government cooked up a couple of years ago, and it means that when I get a new client, in this case Mr. Smith, I fill out a little form and I send it into the Registrar of Lobbyists, and that, as far as I know, is the last you ever hear of it.
But it gives you a seal of approval?
In a way. I haven't noticed it affecting the bank balance very much, but it was said at the time that this licensing would in fact give us a legitimacy we didn't have before. So you have legitimacy. Well, with your new legitimacy, try lobbying Senator Richardson. Right. Well, I think Senator Richardson, there's a lot of toing and froing in the bureaucracy on this. As you can imagine, there are some are in favour, some against, and I think we're going to have a lot of trouble with Treasury. But they aren't the real problems. I think we'll probably prevail on that, okay. But by gee, I'm worried about the greenies.
It's impossible to nobble greenies, but you've got to run over them. For a long time we've discovered they get in the road all the time, and we've got to go through just on 100 miles of national park. You are not going to convince the greenies that going through 100 mile of national park is a good idea. You are just going to have to do it and wear the fact that the flack's coming. When we started the proposal, we knew we'd get the flack. We allowed for the fact that we'd get it. We've got the overwhelming support of the people, so the greenies are just going to have to wear it.
Okay, we've got that's fair enough. We probably, you know, we'll just have to build that into the whole proposal. How do you think, you know, we can? Dick Smith's a well-known national personality. The minister's on side. We've got a lot of horsepower with this proposal. Do you think we're going to be able to push it through?
Well, given that Dick Smith's always hanging around national parks, flying around them or skiing them or something, he's probably pretty au fait with what greenies think and want to do. I'd send him to go and smooth talk the greenies. He's pretty good at that sort of thing. And tell him that, you know, we'll plant flowers along the tracks or something, and it won't be too bad. Whatever, he'll come up with some proposal. And probably I'd also suggest he go up to Sydney, see Rand, and perhaps we might get a little bit more parkland proclaimed somewhere else as some sort of compensation.
Well, you've obviously got the Senator on side. What about the unions? Mr. Paramour is General Secretary of the Shunters and Railway Persons Union. Would you have a word with him?
Absolutely, and I think that's very early on in the piece, so I'll give him a call, and as is well known, all these things are always done over lunch. So can we have lunch one day, Peter? Do you think we can tee that up?
Yes, certainly we can have lunch and discuss it. We're very sceptical of the plan. Our relationships with the State Rail Authority and with Mr Hill, as you know, haven't been very good in the past. And we'd want very clear assurances on what this would mean for our members, what conditions he intended to try and undermine, and until such time as we work those matters out fully, I think our members wouldn't be very supportive of the proposal at all.
Mr MacKellar, you're leader of the opposition. The opposition is rather more attracted, as far as bicentennial projects go, to the Turn the Rivers Back project. the idea of turning the northern rivers inland so that instead of flowing out to the sea, they enrich the grazing land of northern New South Wales and Queensland. What prospects do you have? You had a 45% of the electorate vote. What prospects do you have of convincing the government to go with that scheme?
Very little, I would say. They have learnt to a certain extent from their previous experience where they didn't put into practice any of their promises that they made before the election, and they got a bit of a belting during the election time because of that. So they're more wedded to the party policy than previously was the case.
Have a word with your leader in the upper house, Senator Withers.
Reg, this looks like a typical government situation, wildly impractical. And have you got any ideas of how we can hold it?
Mike, it's one of those simple Sydney socialist cons. I mean, here we are, we've got all the sons of convicts in the Rum Corps about to steal the wealth dug up by decent people in West Australia and Queensland to be spent on weekend jaunts for those harbour-siders. It's not on, pal. You know, my electorate would riot.
But how do you stop it?
I'm going to chuck out the budget.
You don't quite have the numbers for that. But
Yes.
Mr. Lanigan,
take it out of the budget.
The front bench opposition spokesman who's most vociferous in his support of the Turn the Rivers Back scheme is Bill Gladhand. He used to be your minister. He was a former Minister of Enterprise, and you remember years ago when you first discussed with him the Turn the Rivers Back scheme, you remember vividly his reaction. He said, "That's the most preposterous idea I've ever heard. It's Malcolm playing at King Canute. Drop it immediately." Are you going to tell Mr. Brown that Bill Gladhand, who's making a speech in Parliament at this very moment saying that he would have implemented the Turn the Rivers Back scheme?
No, we don't play politics like that. Once there's a change of government, what's been said beforehand is confidential.
What's been
And
said
it should
beforehand?
be confidential.
Even though Bill Gladhand is lying to Parliament, saying that he was on the verge of implementing the Turn the Rivers Back scheme?
Well, lies are relative in politics, aren't they? You know, there are lies, damn lies, and so on. I don't think you can worry about that. You've just got to leave the politicians to worry about their relations with the public and their consciences. But what you can do is let the facts come out in reports to the government.
But the facts aren't going to come out unless you tell Mr. Brown that his opposite number is lying.
No, that's subjective. That's not something that you do. You hold back. You say to yourself you'd love to tell them, but you don't. It's as simple as that.
You'd love to tell him, but you don't. Is that the correct approach, Sir Lennox, that public servants, even if they know their former ministers are lying, they keep their peace?
Their responsibility, as I said before, is to the sovereign, to the government of the day. I don't think it's any part of the duty of the public servant to be turning up to the government of the day.
Dr. Edwards, you've been seconded to the Australian task force, and as you're going back over the old files, you find a memorandum from Bill Gladhand when he was Minister of Enterprise, putting in writing what he said so vividly to Mr. Lanigan. Preposterous idea, I veto it. Do you take the same view as Sir Lennox? Would you not show Mr. Brown the memorandum?
I would take the same view. I'd be intensely interested in the back files in general, and that note in particular, but I would see it as none of my business to be passing it on.
None of your business to be passing it on to show that the former minister was a hypocrite, was lying to Parliament.
That's right.
David Hill, you're prowling the corridors of the department late at night as the political assistant to Mr. Brown, and you go through a few files and you find this memorandum. Will you show it to the minister?
Yes, I would, as an advisor to the minister.
Show it to him.
But the truth is that while the principle that's been outlined is usually adhered to, in practice it isn't. And probably somebody in the department has already done it.
Someone in the department who wants promotion has already...
Not necessarily. It could be anybody in the department through to the permanent head who's endeavouring to establish a relation with his minister.
You've got it anyway. Show it to the minister.
Minister, here's the file.
What do you do with this memorandum? How can you make most political capital out of it?
Well, fish swim, and politicians tend to be political, and I guess that given an opportunity in a debate, I'd drop this right on Mr. Gladhand. I mean,
given an opportunity in the debate, you'll drop it right on Mr. Gladhand. Elaine Darling is one of your backbenchers. Perhaps she'll give you the opportunity by asking you a question. Would that be a way of ventilating it? Dorothy Dix
The old
question?
Dorothy Dix is oftentimes a very useful tool in politics, yes.
Ask Elaine Darling to play Dorothy Dix.
Elaine, I've got a bit of information on Bill Gladhand that he has rather altered his stance on this proposition that we're pursuing. I wonder would you be so kind as to ask me a question in the Parliament so the hypocrisy and the change of stance could be revealed, because it will help me in the debate.
Minister, or John, since we know each other well, you may be aware from questions like this put to me before that I don't like to ask questions that tip the bucket on someone. I'm running on a line of credibility in my electorate, and therefore I don't ask a question like that. And I'd also like to point out that I think this is a red herring.
Well, very high-flying and laudable sentiments, but the political realities are that we have to get this through the Senate. And if that involves turning an argument back against the opposition so that we can achieve our end, which we believe to be in the national interest, well, that's the way that we play politics, Elaine. And I think that the electors of your electorate would be more than pleased to see you acting your role as a politician as well as the local statesman. You're joining this conversation, Senator Richardson. Do you have anything to strengthen Elaine's view of party loyalties?
So look, Elaine, this is a pretty fair opportunity for you to get a run yourself. Your seat has not always been safe. We don't know what happens in a few years' time. If you really want some good publicity, this is not a bad time to do it. If you don't want to do it, I can find 20 volunteers in the next 5 minutes who'd love to, because they'll get a front page and they've never been on a front page. They're cracking the whips, they'd love it. So for God's sake, get off your high horse and ask the question.
Well, I'd like to challenge that. I know that some of you wheelers and dealers look at particular party wisdom, but I'd point out that I am holding this seat of mine on the credibility line for 3 terms running, the first time that we've held that. And you have to learn, I think, to count the numbers. So maybe they're 2 different ways of playing politics. But when it comes to winning a seat one by one, and I feel that I have to be myself, and I know about all of those numbers because, as you're aware, the whip has offered me this type of question, and everyone runs along their own lines, and you can always find people to ask the different types of question, and I'm sure you will.
Oh, we will, but given that you're one of those in the forefront for future ministerial positions, and given that you'll be looking around for support, I'd have thought that if you did this, you'd be able to expect some support from quarters where perhaps you wouldn't have got it before. So it mightn't be a bad opportunity on 2 fronts for you.
Are you kidding?
I never kid on matters like that. I never kid on matters like that.
Elaine Darling is running on the credibility line. You've got to get your cabinet submission together.
Are you going to write train running on the railway line? Yes.
Yes, that's right. It will. Mr. Lanigan, how are you going to write this first draft?
Well, we've got problems, haven't we? Because if the objective evidence is that this is going to cost far more than it will be worth, if the evidence is that it will never pay, if the reasonable assumption is that with all this vast expenditure, the government is going to have a millstone round its neck in a relatively few years, are we really serving the minister if we just pander to his short-term political advantage by saying this is a good thing, and before the next election, perhaps, it emerges that it's costing far more than the government can afford, having regard to other priorities.
So you put in all the pros and all the cons in
Indeed, but we must try, at least in the first draft, to put the costs as well as the benefits.
There are an awful lot of cons in Mr. Lanigan's first draft, Minister. Are you going to tidy it up?
Well, let me go back a step. I don't know if I'm a very peculiar minister, but I don't necessarily accept the advice of my own personal advisors or the department.
Well, there are 2 cabinet submissions. There's the glowing submission from the Department of Enterprise as vetted by Mr. Brown, and there's a rather critical submission by the Treasurer, Mr. Dawkins. Mr. Ramsey, as political correspondent of the Australian Herald, can you get hold of cabinet submissions?
No.
Can't you? Mr. Lanigan has a copy, Mr. Brown, Mr. Hill?
No, we might... I've heard a bit about this round Parliament House. Journalists are talking about it, and they feed off one another.
Would you ring up Mr. Lanigan and ask for his thoughts on the Australian project?
No, I'd first probably try to get in touch with Minister Brown, because he's got my seat on the plane, if you remember, and I still haven't had my,
you want to call
my quid pro quo. That's right.
Call it in.
What's this on? Now, I gave you my seat on the plane, John. You promised that sometime in the future that you'd pay me back with a story. Now, possibly it's going to have to be off the record, but what can you tell me about this, this business that's going on that Dick Smith's put up? I know he's a big supporter of the party. He kicked in the can for the election campaign. So, you know, what's going on here?
Well, what's going on here, Alan, is a proposition that I favour as the Minister for Enterprise. It's certainly in line with how we view Australia's future, particularly in terms of mass transportation.
Mr. Ramsey, you're dining rather late this evening at Kemlani's, the fashionable Canberra restaurant, and it's packed, but as you... they find you a table, and it's just been vacated by Mr. Brown, and he pats you on the back as he goes out, the way cabinet ministers do to journalists. And as you
what with?
as you take the seat, something crinkles underneath you. It's a large brown envelope, Department of Enterprise, Cabinet submission. What do you do?
I pick it up and I put it in my pocket and I say nothing.
Yes, well, you can just see Mr. Brown through the glass of the restaurant window, signalling to his Commonwealth car driver. You've just got time to rush out and give it back to him.
No, I don't.
You don't?
No.
You're not afraid of the Crimes Act? There are cabinet submissions, obviously, inside.
Well, I'm not quite sure what's inside. He's left something behind. It looks, I've had a discussion with him earlier in the day. He hasn't given me much joy. I hadn't expected much joy, but he hasn't given me much. I'm still a bit resentful about the fact that I'd given up my seat originally and I still haven't got much for it. Here's an opportunity, perhaps, to get a story, maybe get something on this. At least I'll look at it before I give it back to him.
It's sealed. It's sealed.
Yes, that's what I mean. Well, I'll open it.
You'll open it.
But not at that. I'll take it away.
Steam it open.
Yes.
You'll steam it open, and there, Bicentennial Project, Great Works, Cabinet submission on Austrain, Cabinet in confidence. You going to read any further?
Yes, I am. I'm going to read the lot.
You're going to read the lot. What's going to happen to him, Sir Lenox, if he not only reads it but publishes it?
Oh, he'll get a higher salary and public acclaim.
And we'll sell a lot of newspapers.
And you'll sell a lot of newspapers. Well, unfortunately, these cabinet submissions from Mr. Brown and from Mr. Dawkins are rather boring, particularly Mr. Dawkins, because there are lots of facts and figures. But there is one line in his submission that catches your eye. We're not satisfied, says the Treasury, that all safety tests can be completed on Austrain before its bicentennial inauguration. Is that a factor that you want to play up?
Well, it's interesting. But what is more interesting, quite clearly, is the very strong public service opposition to this whole proposal. It's coming through very clearly from his department. They don't like it. The Minister is obviously pursuing this, irrespective of the public service opposition.
Of course, in your reading about fast trains, you read that the Paris to Lyon fast railway has been so successful that the lucrative airline that used to run between Paris and Lyon had to close down. The proprietor of the Australian Herald, Sir Rupert Fairpacker, owns the airline, or one of the airlines, that plies between Sydney and Canberra. Does that make you play up the safety factor on the Austrain?
It makes me wonder whether the story might finish up appearing in a newspaper.
But it's in the management's interest to knock it, isn't it? Because Austrain would be competing with...
Oh, yes, I see what you mean, yes. It's in their interest, in fact, to
knock it, because it competes with Sunset Airlines.
With their own airline, that's right, yes.
You're particularly impressed by the line that in the Treasury submission about the 50% of the passengers being lost for the airlines.
Yes, the story is going to carry itself, and quite clearly it's also going to be in the management interest, so they are going to be as interested in publishing it as I am going to be in writing it.
Would you mention the fact that your newspaper had a conflict of interests?
I think the story would make it clear from the fact that in the submission that it was going to damage the airline, that would become clear in the story.
That would become clear. There'd be no need to spell out the fact that the proprietor of the Australian Herald owns an airline.
Yes.
No need at all to spell that out. Why not?
Because we know that everybody else is going to make this known. Also, our publisher is a very well-known figure. Everybody knows that he owns the airline.
Everybody
knows. Hide the fact.
Is that good enough, Mr. Dawkins, for the press not revealing conflicts of interest in editorials and stories like this?
Well, I think we would probably rely on the other newspapers or other media outlets to reinforce this particular point. It's not always the case that with a highly centralised media as we have, for the proprietors to be as candid as they might be.
Senator Withers, could the proprietors be more candid in situations like this?
I think it's an irrelevance. I don't read newspapers.
You don't. But the people do.
No, I don't think they do. I think only about 50% do. Only politicians and journalists read newspapers. Real people read the sporting news.
Yeah. 3 days before the vital cabinet meeting, a much-loved government backbencher dies. He'd held the seat of Steedman in the outer Canberra suburbs, and he died from stress brought on by the long sitting hours in Parliament House. It's an election that's not going to be easy for the government. He scraped in last time with a strong loyalty vote. Austrain is very popular in his electorate, Senator Richardson. There's nothing Canberra people seem to like more than getting out of it. And does this help the project, the fact that there's a by-election?
Well, it's obviously going to do it a hell of a lot of good. Given that we've only been in government a week, so far a lot's happened. And
a week is a long time in politics.
Hopefully the Cabinet aren't taking too much notice of Ramsey's story, because they're still looking at what we said in the platform, how we won the election. They're going to stick. And so far I'm not too worried. Now that we've got a by-election and the people of Canberra are desperate to have an Austrain, that strengthens John Brown, who's a good friend of mine. I'm happy about that. The next thing we do is look at who wins the pre-selection.
Mr. Dawkins, it looks as though you're going to have a tough time in Cabinet.
Yes, I think that's right. We've got a prime ministerial commitment. We've got a by-election where this could be a key issue. We've got to find a way of kind of saying that we're very enthusiastic about this particular project, at least until such time as the by-election's out of the way.
Mr. Dawkins, you fight a valiant battle in Cabinet, but the numbers are against you. Your opposition to Austrain doesn't succeed. Cabinet decides to go ahead. You've got a press conference later in the day. Mr. Ramsey, what questions do you have for the Treasurer?
You're getting a lot of opposition from your own departmental advisors that this is a waste of money, a very costly enterprise. How do you publicly respond to that?
It's possible that this scheme may have to be subsidised in order to operate effectively. And I think it was correct for those particular points to be brought out, but in the end the government has made a decision. It was an election commitment, and we're very enthusiastic about proceeding with this project.
Are you personally very enthusiastic, Mr. Dawkins?
No. And the points that I was...
Did you vote against it in Cabinet?
Yes, the point I was trying to make to my colleagues was that perhaps this proposal was okay so long as they were prepared to cut the road program in half.
So you think it's a disaster scenario, the decision that the government has just taken?
I think that unless we're prepared to cut the road program in half in order to pay for this scheme, then I think we're going to be in a great deal of problems coming up to the next election, because after all, it's not costing us...
Are you really going to attack a decision that your government has just made?
No, of course not.
But you just have. You've just given the media. What are you going to put on the headlines tomorrow?
I was just interested in the fact I didn't know whether he was talking to the press when he was saying no, that he opposed it, or whether he was talking to you.
He was talking to me.
Yes.
If the press had asked you those questions, would you have answered them the same way?
No, of course not.
Of course not.
I see. How would you have
We've really got a story then.
How would you have answered them if the press had asked you, are you personally opposed to it? Did you vote against it?
I would have said that the arguments that I put forward in the Cabinet and how I lodge my vote in the Cabinet is my business, And as far as I'm concerned, the government has made a decision which I fully support.
Well, the Austrain project has been approved by Cabinet, John Brown. You've got your green light. Of course, the first thing you have to consider is which of the fast trains you should go for, the Paris-Lyon train or perhaps the train that runs by British Rail from London to Bristol. Your department advises you that it's important that you should go to Paris and see the fast train in action and discuss the licensing agreement with the French Minister for Transport. The Prime Minister thinks it's a very good idea that you should go.
Does Alan Ramsey think it's a good idea?
Alan Ramsey thinks it's a wonderful idea because he gets to go with you.
Oh, well, maybe that puts a different aspect on his views on this thing.
Parliamentary committee too.
Your wife is very keen to go. She runs a boutique in Sydney of fashionable clothes called the Micturating Marsupial, and she would very much like to see the new Paris fashions, do some buying for the boutique. Is that all right? Can she do that?
Not the way this government works now.
I see. So she's got to sit in the five-star hotel and twiddle her thumbs?
She rarely travels with me, I can assure you.
But she wants to travel with you this time, and while she's accompanying you, as you're entitled to have her there, she wants to do a little work.
Hmm?
Can she do that?
Why not?
Why not? Why not, Mr. Ramsey?
Why not indeed?
Why not indeed? So she can do that. You have a very productive trip, Mr. Brown. You travel the railroad between Paris and Lyon. You knot out a draft agreement with the French Minister of Transport. You come back via the Grand Canyon where you see some of the earth-moving equipment that the Ausrail Corporation is using. You're just in time to catch a seminar in Honolulu on life on the fast track, the future of the super train, and you come back and Mr. Ramsey is there to interview you. What questions do you have for the Minister?
Do you think the expense of the trip was justified in going over to look at this favoured project of yours, Minister?
As in all the three trips that I've taken as a Minister for this government, yes, I think I've come back with the goods on every occasion.
But the cost of this trip for 4 weeks has been $67,000. Now, you've travelled first class everywhere, you've stayed in $500 a night hotel rooms. Looks like to the ordinary public you've had a damn good time. $67,000 for your 4 weeks surely has got to be a bit much.
Well, I mean, I could have made it more cheaply, I guess. I could have put a haversack on my back and ridden a bike.
The French Transport Minister with whom you negotiated the draft contract is very keen on it, so keen that he pays you a return visit. You have a reception for him, and he gives you some tokens of his esteem. Original Chanel perfume, very large bottle, $500. Will you accept that?
No, I will register it, as every minister must do. If any gift comes his way officially beyond the value of $200, it must be surrendered, and so it should be.
Must be surrendered?
Yes.
To whom?
It has to be reported to the Prime Minister and Cabinet and surrendered to the Consolidated Revenue.
The other gift that has come your way, Senator Richardson, from the French government is a dozen bottles of Chateau Lafite Rothschild of the sort that are auctioned at Sotheby's for enormous sums. Can you accept that? You're not a minister.
Think seriously about it. What I'd probably do is keep a couple of bottles for myself and then spread the rest around.
You could give one to every member of Cabinet except the Prime Minister, who doesn't drink.
Well, I could do that. I could probably also give it to some colleagues on the backbench. You've got to make sure that they're happy. It's not merely ministers you've got to keep happy.
Mr. Hill, you're at the reception and you're talking animatedly with the French Minister for Transport, and he tells you that it's the custom in his country for politicians who visit without consorts to be provided with ladies from Madame Claude's. He's staying at room 511 at the Lakeside Hotel and wonders whether someone can visit him about 11:30 this evening. Can you arrange that?
No.
You can't? You can't get anything in Canberra after 11 o'clock.
Well, I don't know if that's the done practice in Canberra, but if it is, I really wouldn't know how to go about it.
I'd probably Senator Richardson is
I would
over
probably
there
ask Senator Richardson what the conventions are in Canberra.
Ask Senator Richardson.
Senator Richardson, at these sort of receptions in Canberra, I've just been proposed to by the head of the SNCF Railways. He wants a woman. Over to you.
Well, I would say to you, David, that if the French consul wants a woman, he'll have to find it himself. We don't do that sort of thing here. We don't procure.
I'm relieved you should say so.
For other legations.
You go so far as to help him by looking up the yellow pages of the Canberra phone book, and
No,
there is an escort agency called the Transport of Delight. 24-hour visiting service at an address out in Steedman. You'll direct his attention to the yellow pages and invite him to look at that. And the woman who turns up at room 511 is Lavinia Upright, who's a legal assistant in the Crown Solicitor's office, working part-time as an escort. Mr. Paramour, you're her union representative, and she rings you the next morning just to check that her new part-time job is in order. Is it?
No, it's not, because we wouldn't be in favour in the current economic climate of her having a second job. We'd see it first of all as taking away job opportunities for other workers.
This should be one.
Thank you.
If she were in your department, Mr. Lanigan, would this be improper for her to take a second job?
It would be improper if we knew about it. But the chances are we wouldn't know about it, wouldn't we? She'd be flattered by this man's attention, surely.
Austrain is going ahead. The Austrain project, Elaine, darling, is very, very effective and very important to your electorate, because you're the member for the electorate of Gorton, which is, about halfway between Sydney and Canberra. And your constituents are very keen that you should get a whistle stop at Gorton Station. Unfortunately, that will add about 10 minutes to the trip between Sydney and Canberra. How would you go about convincing the minister that the train ought to make the stop?
Well, first of all, I'd I'd look at my constituency and see what reasons there would be for that train to stop at Gorton. Obviously, we are in the area of the National Park, and it's within distance of this whistle stop, and we feel that whereas that deviation was made around the park, it still is a great opportunity to build up tourism.
You're very amenable, but there are problems. You want to get to Canberra in 59 minutes. The Ausrail Corporation feels that there are some difficulties with a stop at Gorton, and it all takes a lot of time. And the editor of your local paper, the Gorton Advertiser, is very angry about your efforts. He writes an editorial in which he says, what's the point of electing people to this reptile pit of corruption? It would be an act of good citizenship to dynamite the VIP carriage of the Austrain as it crosses Gorton Gorge, and all the freeloading MPs would end up in the river. What are you going to do about that editorial?
I'd have to... What I'd want to do, if the editor was a reasonable person...
He's not.
Well, since he's not...
By definition, he's not.
The editor, Eric Bombast, is by no means reasonable.
Well, there could be two reasons for being bombastic, one believing something and one not. As he's not... There is nothing that I could do about that editor. I feel that to keep playing up and trying to get through to someone who is flat out to dirty what it is that you're doing, it's better just to leave it and to turn around and do something constructive.
The Attorney General and the Prime Minister are extremely angry because they point out that the editorial, which Bombast is so pleased with that he's repeated in the next edition, is a contempt of Parliament. And there's a big debate in the House, a joint sitting, which happens to be during the experimental period for television. Are you in favour of television in the House, Senator Richardson?
No.
Why not?
I worry that people will never understand what goes on in parliaments if you have television recording its proceedings.
Well, there is, in fact. The Fairpacker television network is very keen. It has just abandoned televising the cricket, and it needs some Australian content. And it wants to put highlights of the day's play in Parliament on every evening in place of the late movie, with a commentary by Kate Fitzpatrick and George Nagus. Is this going to be helpful to bring Parliament to the people, to save all those school kids catching the train to Canberra to see their representatives at work?
If they are to do that, then I hope they're really showing some sort of a resume of question time, where at least all of the greats and the gods are present and doing battle, rather than some of the quieter moments that we find in the pig meat eradication bill or something. You've got to be a bit careful and choosy about what you show.
A bit careful about choosing what you show. Senator Withers, would you be happy for Parliament to be televised?
Yes, our ancestors opposed the print media coming in 150 years ago. I don't think it's done Parliament any harm, hasn't done it much good. Plus the fact I'd rather the viewer see it direct than get it second-hand through a print journalist.
Yes. So you're in favour of the Fairpacker television media doing the highlights of the day's play?
They should see us warts and all.
See us as you are?
I think question time's the silliest time. After all, that is not questions without notice, it's questions without answers. And television question time may be great theatre for the gallery, but it's quite futile.
You don't mind them taking a commercial break during their speeches?
No.
Let's go back to the Austrain project. The secret of this train's speed is the metal coating used on its wheels. It's a metal coating that is a compound. Part of it is kryptonite, a new metal that's been discovered recently in South Africa and is only mined in South Africa. Mr. MacKellar, as you're the Minister for Enterprise, it's a mine that falls below international standards in treatment of black labour. Could this be a problem?
It could be a problem, dependent upon the government's policies in relation to gaining of goods or products from South Africa.
There has not been yet a trade embargo on South Africa, and in fact the kryptonite that the Ausrail Corporation is importing is brought from France because the French railways have bought it from South Africa. They've done a bit of reprocessing at Cherbourg, and the kryptonite is at this moment on the SS Carte Blanche that is steaming towards Sydney. Unfortunately, the waterside workers have taken a more aggressive view than the government. They've put a ban on all South African originated goods. Are you going necessarily to let the public know this fact that you and Mr. Hill alone know?
If this metal is required, there is no trade and government policy which prevents us acquiring this material, we should acquire it.
You should acquire it. You get a question in Parliament. Are any South African companies directly involved in the Austrain project?
If they're not directly involved, and the question is, are they directly involved, one would answer the question honestly.
Which is no.
Which is no.
Which is no. Dr. Edwards, you're a member of the Austrain task force, and you rather support the waterside workers' action in taking steps not to unload any goods that originate in South Africa. You are aware that the kryptonite that's on the carte blanche is in fact originally from South Africa, even though it's been bought by the French government railways and reprocessed there. Would you feel it necessary to leak that fact to the press or to tell Mr. Paramour?
No. I would want to assure, on the contrary, I would want to assure my head of department of that fact. I would want to know that he knew that fact because it's vital information. And I would find conflict between my personal views and my professional interests. But I would not let the personal views override. It's even on principle I wouldn't do it, but I would also not do it because I might be found out.
You wouldn't do it because of your principle and because you might be found out. You'd put your personal views aside. Do you think it's easy to do that?
It's not easy, no.
You're having a drink with Mr. Paramour, who's the secretary of the Waterside Workers' Federation, and he asks you about the Austrain project and whether there's any South African goods involved. What do you say?
Might depend on how much I've had to drink.
You had very small martini.
I'm not prone to telling untruths, and if I could at the time think of a white lie, I would use it. I would try and protect.
A white lie about South Africa.
about whether or not this, about the origin of the component.
You'd say it came from France?
If I could tell it that way, and I didn't feel that it was a blatant lie, I would do it that way.
Suppose that the question to the minister had been, are there any South African originated goods involved in the Australian project? And the minister had said, no, or not to my knowledge. He'd lied to Parliament. Would that change it? No. Would that change it for you?
I think in a sense it would make it easier. I would feel an obligation.
An obligation to do what?
Not to disclose the truth if I would feel the need to protect my minister.
The need to protect a minister who's lied to Parliament? Shouldn't you protect the people from the minister's lies?
If I were to do that, I'd find another mechanism for doing it. As I said, I would go to my head of department with that knowledge, but I don't see why I should be telling a particular lobbyist, with only that lobbyist having the advantage of that knowledge.
You could tell Mr. Ramsey, so he could tell the world that the minister had lied.
I could do that, but I would think there were other mechanisms by which the truth needs to come out, and that's what I would explore.
Who would you explore them with?
I would go to my head of department and I would...
Go to Mr. Lanigan.
I find myself in a difficult position, Secretary. I've been approached by the media and I've been approached by the union movement. They are onto the scent of the fact that our minister has lied in Parliament on this issue. What do you advise me to do?
Well, that's none of our business. We must maintain confidentiality. But the trouble is, in these days of ready photocopiers, how many people know about this? Because someone is going to take a copy of a document on an old file and give it to the press anyway. That's how the National Times operates. It wouldn't be here if it were not for all these leaks. And most of the leaks, of course, are quite false, but that's beside the point. But I don't know that we can do anything other than say it is important in government that any minister should have a confidential source of permanent advice based on continuity of experience, and we destroy that if the minister can't rely on us to be loyal to him.
And so you, as a public servant, will stand silently by while the minister lies to Parliament.
That's his responsibility.
That's his responsibility, not yours. Sir Lenox, is this the right approach for a public servant to take, or are there times in extremis where the public servant should speak out and expose the minister?
First part of your question I would answer and say it's dreadfully wrong. But the answer and remedy is not to do as you suggest in the second part, to expose the minister. The permanent head in these circumstances has an immediate responsibility to give to his minister a draft statement to make in Parliament correcting the error that he previously made. And indeed he has a greater responsibility in the first place to have drafted a correct answer to the parliamentary question. This is not altogether a hypothetical question. It has happened in Australia in the past. I believe myself that the disappearance of the Prime Minister arose from an error of judgment caused by being hounded to death by worry. The origins of that lay in an incorrect answer to the Parliament, which his officials did not advise him to correct. I have quite firm views on this, and the Minister advised by his permanent head that he'd made an error, it would be one of the occasions on which he would not denigrate the permanent head in public, but would be utmostly thankful to him.
The bicentennial election is coming soon. It will be a very interesting election for this reason, that the High Court, in the first test case on the new Australian Bill of Rights, has struck down that old 1924 law that requires compulsory voting. The Chief Justice says the right to vote implies the right not to vote, the right to travel freely implies the right not to be forced to travel to the polling stations. Mr. Richardson, what is this going to mean for your party organisation?
A great deal of difficulty. Traditionally, when one looks at by-election results, Labor voters have been worse at turning out than Conservative voters. Therefore, we have to reorient the last 90 years of our campaign techniques to getting them out to vote on the day.
You'll have to start kissing babies and...
No, it's not a matter of kissing babies. It's a matter of rounding bodies up. To round bodies up, we're going to have to go on a greater bit of research to make sure we can identify where Labor Party voters are we're going to have door-knocking teams on the day to get out there and literally drag them to the polls. That's going to have to be our new role.
One thing that has happened recently in Canberra is that ASIO has completed its move from Melbourne to Canberra. There are a lot of men in trench coats combing the city who seem to think it's their job, as undoubtedly it is, to inquire into the private lives of diplomats and public figures. Their most productive enterprise so far has been to set up the Transport of Delight, that visiting escort agency out in Steedman. It's been very popular among the embassies after the French Transport Minister recommended its services. You're acting Prime Minister, Mr. Dawkins, when the head of ASIO comes to you and tells you that Barry Borger, MP, the Minister for Ethnic Affairs and Women's Rights, uses the Transport of Delight regularly. What do you do with that information?
Well, that depends. I suppose I would ask, is there any security issue involved in that? I think I would first ask, how did they know?
Oh, because they run the escort agency.
Well, I mean,
they've set it up. Wonderful intelligence.
Yes, well, I think I would want to pursue that a bit further as to whether that was a legitimate activity.
But our particular problem is that the woman that he favours for these exploits is Lavinia Upright, the assistant in the Crown Solicitor's office, who's still working out of interest at the agency, but she's also the favoured escort of Max Smirnoff, who's the cultural advisor to the Soviet embassy and we suspect is the top KGB man in Canberra. Do you think there's a security implication at this point, Mr. Dawkins?
Oh, quite clearly, yes.
Quite clearly. Barry Borger might spill cabinet secrets while he's impersonating the Prime Minister.
Well, Barry Borger sounds a bit of a dope to me. I think
yeah?
I think.
Well, you'd have to be in your cabinet.
I think he should certainly be counselled. But basically, it's conduct unbecoming of a minister, and he shouldn't.
So he should be warned, and Smirnoff should be deported.
Oh well, I'm not sure about Mr. Smirnoff. What's he done?
He's just the cultural advisor at the Soviet embassy.
Yes. Well, I'm not quite sure whether. I mean, I'm not sure you'd want to have a diplomatic incident which would reveal the indiscretions of Mr. Borger.
Aha. Mr. Ramsey, Lavinia bumps into you at the bar of the Lakeside Hotel and wonders whether she might make rather more than her meagre public service salary by selling this story to the press. With an election coming up, what's it worth?
I'd need a lot of proof.
You'd need a lot of proof.
I'd need a lot of proof.
What about
You've got no idea how much proof I'd need.
What about a statutory declaration?
No.
She might perjure herself.
No.
What about photographs?
You're getting closer.
She does have some photographs taken on a boat in Lake Burley Griffin. They're fuzzy. You can't tell one minister from the other from the back. That any help?
No, that's not good enough. No, not fuzzy photographs, thanks. No. Nice, sharp, clear ones, maybe.
I know, she says brightly. What about the minister's new identification card? I slipped it out of his pocket when we were in a passionate embrace last night. Starting to get there?
No, not really.
The minister's ID card? That at least stands up the story of the relationship with the minister.
It adds a little bit to it, but you'd need to go a lot further than that before you'll consider publishing some story on it.
Well, she does.
But you'd be interested.
You'd be interested.
You'd be interested.
Has this ended his ministerial career, Mr. Dawkins?
I think having counselled him to stop it and then not having stopped it, I think he would have no alternative.
You have no alternative to go. Senator Withers, you don't know anything about the security angle. Forget that. All you know is that he's been patronising the agency and has been using a Commonwealth car. That's as far as it goes. Would you make political capital out of it? The opposition, election coming up?
I would hope could restrain myself from doing so. I do not agree with getting into other people's bedrooms or bank accounts. I think that's their business.
Could you restrain him, Mr. MacKellar, as Leader of the Opposition, or would you say, go right ahead?
No, I'd try and restrain him. I think it's, we should really try and get away from this sort of gutter stuff.
It's a red carpet, red letter day coming up, the bicentennial, the inauguration of Austrain. The plan is this, that at Sydney Station, the Premier of New South Wales will make a speech saluting his government's vision and supporting the project. There'll be the brass bands, the red carpet, engine driver Ken Chifley will jump aboard, blow the whistle, and you'll be off to Canberra in 59 minutes flat. At Canberra Station, the Royal Bicentennial Visitor, Prince Andrew, and the Prime Minister will be there to meet it. The Prime Minister will make a speech saluting her government's vision in supporting this project. Mr. MacKellar, as Leader of the Opposition, you have at least been allocated a seat in the VIP carriage. It's not a window seat, and it's next to the toilet. Are you going to accept?
Well, I probably would, and we were mounting a vigorous campaign against the waste and extravagance, I would probably almost certainly refuse.
But it's going to be a very popular occasion. It'll be a historic occasion. You've got the brass bands, the ticker tape, the Premier of New South Wales and the Prime Minister making speeches supporting it.
It'll be in all the newspapers and they'll be around chips the day after.
How are you going to arrange that? I've got a great deal of television interest in this historic event. The ABC now do want the right to broadcast it. So do the Fairpacker Network. They've offered the Ausrail Corporation $200,000 for the rights to broadcast it exclusively. The ABC can't offer any money. It can put up Jill Rann and Molly Meldrum as commentators. Who do you go for?
Everybody. You wouldn't give exclusive.
You wouldn't give it exclusive?
All the publicity you could, because given the finances of this thing, you need every bum on the seat that you can get, and we'd be after every skerrick of publicity. So you wouldn't be looking for $200,000. The publicity would be worth more than that.
But the Fairpacker Network aren't going to screen it unless they have it exclusive.
Then you have to run with that. That happens anyway.
So you give it to the ABC?
You give it to anybody that's interested.
The politician's day, Mr. MacKellar. The government can handle it any way they like. Is this exploiting the bicentennial?
Absolutely.
Can you do anything about it?
You'll watch it happening over the next few years.
Is there nothing that you can do or say to stop them?
Well, you certainly
They
can
come along every 200 years.
Certainly you can point out the extravagances as effectively as you can, but they're the government, they're making the decisions, and they will go ahead with this project.
Is there any way you can get at Mr. Hill? He's the head of the Ausrail Corporation, a Quango. Can Parliament have any power over him?
As ministers have statutory and responsibilities to make decisions, but we can get the head of a Quango or a statutory authority along to a select committee if there is one formed for any particular purpose. Yeah.
There is, and you're chairing it. What questions do you have?
We grill him as extensively as possible to demonstrate the absolute extravagance which is associated with this project.
Grill him.
Mr. Hill, can you tell us in detail the financial background both to the establishment of this project and its projected running costs?
Certainly, and I've already given that information, Minister, to the Parliamentary Public Accounts Committee, of which you're a member, and all the information's there, but I'm quite happy to furnish all of that material to this committee as well.
And in your own opinion, does it justify the exaggerated comments or the comments that are made about it in terms of projected returns?
That's a matter you'll have to ask the government. As I understand it, the government went into this project several years ago, before the bicentenary, knowing that it would need government subsidy, and as I understand it, on advice from the public servants, were aware of the problems of cost overruns, were aware of the additional costs having to divert the railway because of the environmental lobby, were aware of the increased costs as a result of agreement they came to with the Shunters and Fettlers Union, and I don't think there's any surprises in the cost that this railway is now presenting to the community.
Have you any details of the subsidies that will be required?
No, but it'll be significant. Now that the...
Can you give us any ballpark figures?
Only to the extent that the Minister for Finance has advised us that the construction cost to make it viable in the beginning were around $500 million, and I understand the estimated completed cost is around $900 million.
Mr. Cadman, do you have any questions?
Yes, Mr. Hill. In the arrangements for the opening of this railway, who is picking up the tab for the celebrations of this great occasion?
I believe the corporation has the responsibility for making this railway work as well as it possibly can, and we've decided in the corporation to launch the great publicity machine because we now want everybody who can to be using this railway and not cars and aeroplanes and road coaches. Now, quite separate from our organisation of this wonderful festive promotion, the Minister, in his wisdom, has decided that he too would like to participate in the events, and we welcome that because indeed it's his government that have put up the money, and it's his government that will be covering the subsidy needed to operate this railway.
Did you invite the Minister?
I've invited the Minister, sir.
Did you invite the Minister originally?
Yes. We always
so it was your initiative to have the Minister there?
Certainly, on the basis that we couldn't have got away with it any other way.
Thank you. So this is a government occasion rather than an Australian occasion?
It's an occasion for Australia.
It's an historic occasion, and the great day, ladies and gentlemen, dawns at last. You feel a surge of pride, John Brown, as you climb into the cab of the engine alongside Ken Chifley. Of course, you didn't know that millions of television viewers would miss the start because the ABC ran out of film. You didn't realise that Eric Bombast had chained himself to the track just beyond Gorton Gorge, and several hours were lost cutting him free. You couldn't have foreseen that during the long wait at Canberra station, the Royal Bicentennial visitor, Prince Andrew, would strike up a conversation with a representative of the Crown Solicitor's Office, Lavinia Upright, leading to complications which the palace is still trying to unravel. And it wasn't your fault that a switching mistake just outside Steedman sent Austrain up the branch line to Mount Ainslie, which hadn't been finished and didn't lead down again. But nonetheless,
nobody's perfect, are they?
Your party scrapes home in the bicentennial election, and here you are at your Sydney home a couple of days later, awaiting the call from the Prime Minister. What position do you think you deserve this time?
Well, given all those disasters, if the train got there, I think I should be made the Minister for Miracles.
You should get a promotion. You get a telephone call. It's from the Prime Minister's Press Secretary, congratulating you on your new appointment as Tourist Commissioner in Vancouver. Thank you all.